I almost didn't make this video. It's a story about an old Bible. It does happen during the Cultural Revolution. He broke free from them and ran straight towards the fire. He reached in with both hands and pulled the Bible out. And that night, he had gone with the Lord. Hi there, Ziola here. Hey, so by the time you're watching this, Easter might already been over, but still, happy Easter. I grew up in a house church in China, and if you watched my Christmas episode before, you might remember that I said that one day I would share some of those stories. I've always been putting this off for a long time because these stories, they aren't just distant history. They're close, like really, really close. Some of them were told to me by my parents, and some of them happened to the people that we know. And when something is that close, it's really hard to tell it without feeling everything. And for a while, I honestly thought that I just shouldn't tell them at all. Maybe I should just stay in the comfort zone, the safe zone, just be a normal Chinese girl sharing interesting stuff online. I mean, let's be real, views matter and I do care about them. But then I realized that's not really why I started this channel. Because there are some stories that deserve more than just being good content. There are voices that were never meant to be heard publicly, people whose names well, probably you never knew. But they lived, they believed, they have done great work for the house of the Lord in China, and even when it cost them everything. And somehow their story never made it online, never made it to this world we live in now. That didn't feel right to me. So I'm going to start telling them in this series, stories my parents told me about people who were, some of them no longer here, but those lives still means a lot. And maybe you're not here by accident either, so if you're willing to listen, let's begin. So not long after my parents became Christians, I was born. I grew up in a house church in Beijing, China. Ever since I was little, my parents would tell me stories about the church, about how house churches in Beijing, China first began. And looking back now, I think of house churches movement in China were like a huge tree with countless branches spreading out over time and each become a different house church that we see now. And that tree, at least in the stories I grew up hearing, started with 3 pastors who felt called by God to build what you can call one of the very first house church in China. And their last names were Cai, Yuan, and Xie. And even today, in Beijing house church circle, they're still often mentioned as elders, people who were there at the very beginning. The story we're about to talk about happened sometimes between the late 1950s and the mid-1960s. I actually asked my dad for the exact year, but he couldn't really say. He told me that back then, lives were so hard that people weren't really keeping track of time. But what we do know is that it does happen during the Cultural Revolution. China was in chaos everywhere you looked. There were portraits of Mao, and if someone didn't follow or worship him, the consequence could be very severe. At that time, these 3 pastors were invited to help build what was essentially a state-controlled church. But because their faith was in God, not in Mao, they refused. And that decision led to serious consequences. They were labeled as counter-revolutionaries and ended up spending more than 20 years in prison. And yet, even through all of that, they had held on to their faith. They stayed hopeful. And after they were released, they didn't stop. They continued to share the gospel and eventually helped establish new house churches, including the one my parents were part of. Now, decades have passed. These men had all gone home to be with the Lord. But the seeds that they planted have grown into something much bigger, like a new tree still standing in the city. The story I'm about to tell you today comes from something my parents heard, one of Pastor Ty's sermons. It's a story about an old Bible. After Pastor Ty was taken away to prison, his family was left behind, just his wife and her father. His father-in-law was also a pastor because he was older and because he had kept a low profile. He wasn't arrested. But in the neighborhood, everyone knew who he was. And during the Cultural Revolution, that alone was dangerous. It wasn't just the pastor who was imprisoned. Even those who weren't arrested were still at risk. At the time, there were groups known as the Red Guards. To show loyalty, they would search homes, and if they found anything considered counter-revolutionary, books, writings, anything like that, it would be burned on the spot. And a Bible was one of those things. Back then, among several house churches in that area, there was only one Bible, and it was in the hands of that elderly pastor. It wasn't just important to him, it meant everything to the believers around him. So he made a decision. He hid it, and from that moment on, he lived very carefully, quietly, cautiously, trying to protect something that at the time was not allowed to exist. But word already spreading. People knew he was a pastor, and one day the Red Guard came. And he and his daughter tried to stop them. They stood in the doorway trying to block the way, but it didn't matter. The house was searched, and eventually they found it, the Bible. And then they took it, along with every other book they could find, and threw them everything into the yard. And one of them looked at him and said, almost casually, he said, "Your son-in-law was already been imprisoned as a counter-revolutionary. If you just throw all that away and follow Chairman Mao, you'd be fine. But you won't listen." And this is what happened. So he asked for a match, and he lit it. The flame fell into the pile, and first, it was small, just a flicker. And then slowly it began to spread. And page by page, the fire moved through the books. And just when it looked like the Bible was about to be completely burned up, something in him shifted. It was like something inside of him just wouldn't let go. He broke free from them and ran straight towards the fire. It was already spreading through the pile, and without even thinking, he reached in with both hands and pulled the Bible out. He didn't seem to care about the heat and all. At that point, the Bible was already badly burned. The pages were torn, the edges were black, and it was barely holding it together. He used his own clothes to try to put out the fire, just trying to save whatever he could. That's when they rushed him. They pushed him down to the ground and tried to grab that Bible back. But he held on to it really, really tightly, pressing it against his chest. He just wouldn't let go. So they started kicking him, hitting him, dragging him around, yelling all kinds of horrible stuff at him. But he didn't say anything. He didn't fight back. He just held on to it like that for a very long time. And eventually, They got tired. One of them kind of shrugged and said, "You know what, forget it. It's just an old book, an old man, just let him keep it." And then they just left. The house has been searched, the books has been burned. To them, that was enough. He was still lying there on the ground, holding on to the Bible in his arms. When his daughter came over, she had realized that he had passed out. The Bible was still in his hand. And that night, he had gone with the Lord. I've actually told this story a few times to some of my friends at church here in the US, and a lot of them were very surprised, and they asked me, why would someone go that far just for a Bible? And I usually just smile. And I would ask them, where did you get your Bible? From Walmart? From Hobby Lobby? From Amazon? Or maybe you just downloaded from the App Store. I mean, most people don't even use a physical Bible anymore today, right? But if you lived in a place where the entire city or even your whole church only had one Bible left, and it was the one in your hand, would you do the same thing? I mean, I think you would, because the one who lives in you will give you that courage. And that is the story Pastor Tai had once shared about his father-in-law. And my parents told me that at the end of that sermon, he brought out that Bible, the same one that had been hidden away for many years. It was in really rough shape. The edges were all curled from the fire. Parts of it were burned through, and a lot of the words were barely readable. At first glance, it just looked like a worn out, damaged old book. But to him, it wasn't just a book. To us either, and the interesting part is, my parents, they both work in printing companies. So my mom went up to Pastor Tai and said, "Would you like us to restore it?" And he said yes. So he handed the Bible to her, and 2 weeks later, my parents brought it back. They didn't try to make it look brand new, but simply added a protective cover, something to hold it together, to preserve it better, to protect what was still there. And when Pastor Tai saw it, he was deeply moved, and he was in tears. And from that point on, he treated that Bible like his family treasure. And even now, that Bible still exists, carrying with all those memories and all that hope. And this story also inspired my parents too. It became part of their calling. They went on into devoting themselves to printing Bibles and helped distribute them to many others. And I think that's something I really want to share with you. Don't ignore that small feeling in your heart, that little nudge, that quiet prompting that you sometimes get. Because you never know what God can do with that small thing, right? You never know how one simple action sometimes that feels almost insignificant to you, it might turn into something much bigger than you could ever imagine. And honestly, sometimes I wonder about that old pastor. Maybe in that moment, he wasn't thinking about anything big or heroic. Maybe he was just thinking, if this Bible is gone, what am I going to preach on this Sunday? Maybe it wasn't some grand decision. Maybe it was just an instinct. Just that Holy Spirit in him that said, you need to hold on to this. And yet, that moment, that one decision, have encouraged so many people to keep following Jesus. And I think that's why this story has stayed with me, because it's not really just about one Bible. It's about what people are willing to hold on to, even when everything around them is trying to take it away. Sometimes I think about how easy it is for us. We can just open an app, order a Bible in seconds, or just read it on our phone without thinking it twice, right? And maybe because it's so accessible, we don't always realize what it means to have it. But for some people, it cost them everything. And that same faith, same hope, never disappeared. It will pass down. From that old pastor to his daughter, from Pastor Tsai to my parents, and now to me, and maybe now to you. So wherever you are, I'm really glad that you are here to hear it. Happy Easter. I'm Ziola. See you next time.